I remember that night like it was yesterday. It was one of those nights where everything felt so peaceful and quiet, like the world had gone to sleep. I had just taken out the garbage and was walking back to my RV when I saw him. The man, he was walking towards me, shrouded in darkness. At first, I thought nothing of it, just some stranger walking by. But then he started talking to me, asking me questions about my RV. I tried to brush him off, but he persisted. His voice was gentle, almost soothing, but there was something off about him, a vibe that made my skin crawl. He told me where he lived, even gave me his name. And then he said something that chilled me to the bone. "You should come by my house sometime after me," he said with a sly smile. I felt like running, like getting as far away from him as possible, but I stayed, frozen in place. When I got back to my RV, I locked the door right away, but I could still hear him outside, pacing and mumbling to himself. It was unnerving. I wanted to lock the door by my bed, just in case, but I didn't want to move. I felt like if I moved, he'd know. And then I saw him. He was standing outside my window, staring in at me. He waved, trying to get my attention. I was petrified. What did he want? Why was he doing this? And then he started knocking on my door, over and over again. I waited for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a knife and ran to my mom's house, hoping he wouldn't follow me, but he did. He was waiting for me across the street, like he knew exactly where I was going. It was like he had been watching me for a long time, waiting for the perfect opportunity. It's been weeks since that night, but I still can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that someone is always lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. I don't feel safe anymore, and I don't think I ever will. It was a dark, autumn evening, the type of night where the air is crisp and the world is quiet. I was only 15 at the time, and I felt invincible. I lived in a small town where crime was unheard of, and I never once felt threatened. But that was about to change. I had gone downtown to buy some cigarettes. Yes, I know, I was far too young, but I was a rebellious teenager looking for a thrill. As I walked home, I noticed a man following me. He emerged from the shadows, his greasy hair hanging in front of his face. I wasn't scared, just aware of his presence. He asked me for a cigarette, and I, being polite, gave him one. Then he asked for a light, and I obliged. But something about him gave me the creeps. It was like he was sizing me up, deciding what part of me he wanted to eat first. I quickened my pace, but so did he. He was only a few steps behind me now, and I could hear his heavy breathing. Suddenly, he lunged at me, wrapping one arm around my waist and the other around my neck. I was pinned against him, unable to move. I wasn't scared. I was angry. How dare he touch me like that? I told him I was going to start screaming, and I began stomping on his feet as hard as I could. He hesitated for a moment, then released me and ran up the hill, disappearing behind a bush. I kept my eyes locked on that bush as I made my way home. I was only a block away, and I could see the lights of my house in the distance. I picked up my pace and broke into a sprint. I made it home safely, but I never told my parents what had happened. I was afraid of getting in trouble for smoking and that they wouldn't believe me anyway. Weeks went by, and I forgot all about the man who had attacked me. But then I heard the news. He had grabbed another girl and beat and raped her. I realized that I was lucky. He must have been scared off by my fight response, and I was grateful that it was enough to save me. Years passed, and I buried the memory deep down, just like I had done with the other traumas in my life. It wasn't until I was in therapy that I was able to work through the guilt of never telling anyone what had happened to me. I may have been lucky that night, but I know that not everyone is so fortunate. The world can be a scary place, and we should always be aware of our surroundings. I went to the university at Buffalo fresh out of high school in the early 2000s or so. At that time, the online world was a bit like the Wild West. It included having to do quite a bit more digging to find out specific information than today. Split-second Google search. As such, it was much easier for colleagues in universities to hide or spin campus crime statistics to make themselves look better for prospective wallets. I mean students. Case in point, I was at an orientation a month or two before my freshman year. One of the mass presentations I had to attend was about campus safety. Bright-faced upperclassmen orientation aides enthusiastically verbally filled the school, boasting about how North Campus was at the time the safest town in the country. The only murder in recent history yet occurred 9 years ago to an unfortunate student named ꜱᴛᴏʀɪ, who was murdered on the campus bike path during a lone early morning run. It was a fate that we were assured could be avoided simply by not hitting the bike path alone. What they conveniently neglected to reveal during this presentation was that, hey, the killer had never been caught, and that BLM was not his only victim. He was a serial attacker and eventually a serial killer who had already been active in the area for at least 25 years in downtown Buffalo and on the secluded bike paths of the Buffalo suburbs. Nowhere was safe in retrospect. Had this information been as readily accessible as it is now, it probably would have kept me from the most bone-chilling encounter of my life. Fast forward 3 years for now, though, I was a very depressed 20-year-old who was struggling with her sexual identity and her parents' reaction to it in a much less accepting time than now. I left school to avoid being home, hooked up with a woman who promised me the world, then rejected me in favor of her ex-girlfriend on the very night I moved in. So clearly, I was a very unhappy young adult, desperate for love and a sense of belonging, sometimes to my own detriment. Despite my roommates and many unkind and hurtful gestures, I stuck with it in the naive hope that she would eventually come around and fulfill her pie-in-the-sky promises to me. On a particular July night, that hope just fell flat altogether. I was at Roxy's Green Room, a now-defunct lesbian bar and club that many wayward Buffalo lesbians, myself included, flocked to at night to feel a much-needed sense of community, and hopefully to land a special someone, since the latter was just not happening for me. I was still stuck with my roommate. He liked to dangle emotional carrots over her shoulder out of some sick joy she got from making me hurt, but also hang on to hope. After a promise to hit Roxy's alone with me and talk about us, finally, she showed up with her ex, turned current, and shut me out completely. I was upset enough to leave alone at around 1 a.m., well before the 4 a.m. last call. I was young and spry enough to walk without a ride home, which my usually wiser self would have secured before leaving. While my apartment was technically within walking distance, it was good to go for a half-hour walk or so. Being as emotionally charged as I was, I angrily hoofed it down the main street sidewalk, managing to follow the pedestrian rule of walking against traffic despite stupidly ignoring the rule I knew well from years of watching forensic shows. If you're a woman, never leave a bar at night alone, especially if you have to walk a long distance. I was exactly halfway there when a dark green sedan started driving toward me. I thought nothing of it until the car slowed down near me. As I walked by, a lone middle-aged man was in the car with a fair complexion. I originally associated myself with being Italian, but in retrospect, I could have easily been Puerto Rican or something. He had dark hair, and most importantly, he is dark. I seemed to have no good intentions. I was used to guys being pigs. I'd been catcalled and endured all manner of wholly unwanted, graphic, and hand-fisted advances from dudes everywhere. Although I'd never take the stance that I was asking for. I was young and thin, so I was dressed in a tight red crop top with flared legs and black spandex pants that night. I didn't pay much attention, though. A guy old enough to be my dad looking at me like that now was simply annoyed. My walk quickly resumed. I put the guy out of my mind and continued onward, but the peace, of course, would not last. About 2 or 3 minutes later, I see a familiar green car coming up behind me again. This time the guy's window was down a bit, and he shouted, "Hey." He beckoned to me in a way that made me wonder if he might have mistaken me for a lady of the night. That really incensed me. I flashed him a quick, annoyed look to inform him that, despite my mildly revealing clothing, he was barking up the wrong tree for several reasons. I ignored him and started walking faster. He sped off again, only to turn around once more. At that point, it became clear that this dude was chasing me like a cat burglar in a house. It was before the time of Uber or even the widespread use of cell phones. No cabs were passing by either. Public transit existed, but it was both sparse and did not run nearby. This area, the stretches of Main between intersections, were long, being 15 minutes away from either my home or going back. There was no way I could get anywhere near either place before the green car came up upon me again. I quickly thumbed through my mental list of true crime show-inspired safety tips that would have kept me out of this situation in the first place. Tip 1: get to an open business or something. Then the guy would either give up or get caught. I was coming upon a convenience store on the opposite side of the street. Right, but cigarettes earlier. As I got a bit closer, though, I could see it was unfortunately closed. I looked around for anything else. Another bar, a gas station. The street was flanked by shuttered brick buildings and a locked-up church. Then came the handlights and the car. Once again, the guy slowed down as he approached me, but his demeanor had shifted quite massively. He put his palm out impatiently, as if he couldn't understand why I wasn't coming with him. "Come on," the guy yelled. There was no open window. I kept him out of arm's reach on the sidewalk and once again ignored him. This time I was properly shaken, though. He hit the gas and sped off on his familiar circuit back around to me. I knew I was in trouble. I was genuinely scared. This guy's next move would be to simply grab me off the sidewalk and pull me into his car. I scrambled to figure out what to do. I remembered making myself impossible to ignore and being obviously in distress. Could get me some help from an outside party. I ran right into the middle of Main Street and started frantically waving my hands and shouting at every car coming my way. The first car drove by, the second as well. The terror in me was palpable. I knew the stories of city dwellers like Kitty Genovese's who were left to their horrible fates at the hands of monsters by jaded throngs of people who'd heard the attacks and their cries for help but did nothing. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, though, a van pulled over that had 4 black guys in it. In a game of numbers, this van of guys was much safer than that single stalker in the green car. I opted to take the gamble. I rushed over to them and told them about the man in the green car who was following me around the block over and over. I begged them for a ride home. The driver asked if I had any money in exchange for the favor. Unfortunately, I didn't. He then asked if I had any cigars. At least I may be one of the only people you'll ever meet who actually had their lives saved by cigarettes. Yes, I answered urgently. I just bought a pack. You can have the whole damn thing if you get me home. Admittedly, I was a bit miffed that the driver wanted something from me in exchange for not letting me get abducted off the street. Still, I had the Marlboros in the vehicle, and the stars hopefully aligned after a second or two of thought. The driver agreed. One of the 2 dudes in the back opened the side door for me and got out so I could slide into the seat behind the driver as the door to my safe carriage full of impromptu nights shut and I got buckled in. I looked out the window just in time to see the green car creeping past the van, proving to my saviors that I was telling a very disturbing true story until my dying day. I'll never forget the look in that man's eyes as he was driving past. Feeling safe, surrounded by a closed van full of young, tough-looking rescuers, I looked that bastard dead in the eyes. He gave me the most hateful, evil look I'd ever seen. His eyes were black and thin, almost like a cat's when its hunting instincts had been activated. He sped off into the night, and so did we, taking a less direct route to make sure we lost him. After a blessedly quick jaunt with frequent looks behind my shoulder, I was delivered home safely. 1 pack of cigarettes, short but alive and in one piece. The first thing I did when I got in the door was check the locks on everything. After that, the adrenaline started to wear off and fear set in. I was terrified that the man in the sedan was searching the area where I got dropped off. I grabbed the cordless phone and laid completely flat on the living room floor for hours to keep it totally out of sight from any windows as I lay there. I called the Buffalo police and relayed my terrifying tale, and as much detail as I could give them. Fast forward another 4 years. I'd moved out to Chicago to live with my then girlfriend for about half of my 4 years there. I was pretty homesick. I'd never lived anywhere except my home state of New York, and I went there knowing no one except my ex wasn't exactly an empathetic soul. I coped by keeping up with upstate New York news. On a chilly mid-January morning in 2007, I was at our computer looking up headlines from my home state when one popped up that immediately snared my attention. bike path killer arrested by then. I knew the moniker well. The internet has since aged into a beautiful, organized repository of knowledge, and despite the lack of transparency from my alma mater, I became familiar with the Buffalo area mystery man and his active status throughout my whole time in Buffalo. The man's name was Altamira Sanchez, a middle-aged native of Puerto Rico who coached his son's sports teams and was affectionately referred to as Uncle Al in his neighborhood. As with many other killers, his disguises were his community involvement and being very ordinary. The man was estimated to have been responsible for 9 to 15 camps around the area since 1975. He also confessed to 3 murders: the Gillum murder in 1991, a second one in 1992, and a third that only occurred 3.5 months prior to his capture. I don't know if you've ever felt your heart somehow get wedged into your voice box and drop into the depths of your stomach simultaneously, but believe me when I say it's possible, given the right catalyst. For me, that was the printed proof that the man who was active while I lived in Buffalo frequented the Roxy's area. Furthermore, I knew serial killers rarely take breaks as lengthy as the one between his 1992 and 2006 killings. He must have been attempting to unleash his evil impulses on me. That night, that realization gave me a very bad feeling that I'd crossed paths with someone more dangerous than I'd ever realized. Of course, as soon as I searched the man's name and found his picture, I was horrified, though not surprised, to see those same soulless, predatory eyes I had looked into on that summer night in Buffalo in 2003.